In this video, we're discussing racial, ethnic, and cultural identity to help you prepare for your NCE, CPCE, or whatever other counseling exam you might have coming up. We'll start the video by discussing what are race, ethnicity, and culture. Then we'll move into the racial and cultural identity development model. And to end the video, we'll cover a few other things you might want to know. But before we get to all of that, my name is Keegan. I have a master's degree in counseling and I'm a licensed professional counselor. I make videos like this to help you better understand various concepts in mental health, counseling, and psychology. To begin, let's go over some of the definitions. We'll start with race. This is a term that we all hear often, which might imply that it's easy to define, but that would be false. Race is largely a social construct and something that is based primarily on the physical features of a group of people, such as their skin color. Some people may think that race is genetic, but that is not accurate. In fact, there is not a reliable way to tell from the genetics of a person what their race is. Adding to that, different races are more genetically similar than they are different. Let's look at the American Psychological Association, or the APA's definition of race. They say that race is the social construction and categorization of people based on perceived shared physical traits that result in the maintenance of a socio-political hierarchy. The US Census Bureau's list of racial groups includes African American or Black, White American or Caucasian, Asian American, American Indian or Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander. But this is a limited list of possible racial groups. For example, the US Census Bureau does not consider Hispanic or Latino to be a racial group. They consider this to instead be an ethnic group, which leads us to our next question. What is ethnicity? If the terms race and ethnicity confuse you, you are not alone. These terms are often used interchangeably, and while there is some overlap, race and ethnicity are different things. When it comes to ethnicity, we're referring more to the social identity of a person. A person's ethnicity encompasses the sense of belonging that they can feel, which can be tied to their origins or their expectations of behavior as examples. So where race is typically tied to a person's physical features, ethnicity is more about their culture, the values and beliefs that they and the groups that they belong to have and hold as important. As we discussed, there can be some overlap between race and ethnicity, and these terms can be used interchangeably at times, even though they're different things. As you may have noticed, there is some overlap also between ethnicity and culture. In fact, ethnicity largely encompasses one's cultural identity. This is highlighted in the APA's definition of ethnicity. They say that ethnicity is a characterization of people based on having a shared culture, like language, food, music, dress, values, and beliefs, related to common ancestry and shared history. Additionally, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration says, in some cases, ethnicity also refers to identification with a clan or group whose identity can be based on race as well as culture. Some Latinos, for example, self-identify in terms of both their ethnicity, for example, their Cuban heritage, and their race, for example, whether they are dark or light-skinned. So that is ethnicity. Now, let's move on to culture. Everyone identifies or is affiliated with a group or groups that help build up or influence our cultural identity. When we look at cultural influences, some of the most common that you may recognize are socioeconomic status, where we live, our gender identity and sexual orientation, the level of education that we've received, our job or employment status, as well as political and religious affiliations. However, this is definitely not a complete list. Throughout life, our various interactions are things that help shift and change our cultural influences, as these do not stay the same throughout our lifespan. The APA gives this as a definition of culture: the characteristic attitudes and behaviors of a particular group within society, such as a profession, social class, or age group. Now that we've defined race, ethnicity, and culture, let's look at the racial cultural identity development model. But first, if you're enjoying this video and finding it helpful, please help me out by giving it a like and subscribing. There are various models that encompass identity development, but today we're looking at the 5-stage model from Atkinson, Morten, and Sue. This is called the Racial Cultural Identity Development Model and was previously called the Minority Identity Model. Let's walk through the stages of this model to help you better understand it. The first stage is conformity. At this stage, one is preferring the dominant culture and is holding positive attitudes toward them. They are likely devaluing their own racial or ethnic groups and may even be holding negative views toward them. At this first stage, a person is likely to prefer a counselor from the dominant culture. Dissonance and appreciating is the second stage of this model. At this point, there is more questioning that the person is doing, and there may be more confusion that they're experiencing. They're beginning to move away from seeing the dominant culture as all good. And while this is happening, they're beginning to question their own identity. Additionally, they're beginning to recognize some of the conflicting messages that may exist between the dominant culture and their own cultural group messages. At the second stage, they're also beginning to recognize racism. Here, a person is likely to prefer a counselor from a minority group. The third stage is called resistance and immersion. At this stage, they're accepting their own cultural identity more and also starting to reject the dominant culture. They're likely starting to embrace their own culture more and having more positive attitudes toward it. They're also likely starting to focus more on eliminating oppression within the culture. At this third stage, their anger and distrust for the dominant culture may be growing. Additionally, their preference for their own groups is likely growing, and they're likely experiencing more positive feelings toward other diverse groups. Introspection is the fourth stage. At this point, the person is moving more inward and beginning to question their own personal identity. As this occurs, they're likely beginning to recognize that their own racial and cultural groups are not all good or all bad, and likewise that the dominant culture is not all good or all bad either. At the fourth stage, the person is likely to prefer a counselor from their own racial or ethnic group. Finally, the fifth stage is integrative awareness. Here, they've come to find confidence in their own racial and cultural identity. They will likely have come to have a sense of appreciation for their own racial and cultural groups and have a strong desire to support them. Additionally, they will have come to recognize the effects of racism and that they can be a victim of it. At the fifth stage, a person will likely desire a counselor who shares their worldview, but that isn't necessarily from their same racial or ethnic group. So those are the 5 stages of the racial cultural identity development model. Now that we've covered those, here are a few other things about this model to keep in mind. One thing to note about the racial cultural identity development model is that it also applies to the development of white identity. Second, it can be helpful to recognize that not every person will go through every stage of this model. In fact, a third point to realize is that for some people, they may actually stop progression on the stages and not make it past the second or third stage as examples. A final thing to remember is that people can also move backwards in their stages, meaning that someone may have progressed to the 4th stage of the model and then move backward toward the 2nd stage. That brings us to the end of this video. I hope that you found this information on the racial cultural identity development model to be helpful. While you're here, make sure that you check out some of the other videos on my channel. Thank you so much for watching.